Imagine for a second that you are standing inside one of those classic carnival funhouse mirror mazes. You know the ones.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You look to your left, and suddenly you are 10 feet tall with a tiny head.
Right.
And then you look to your right, and your legs are just completely squished. Now imagine that you have lived your entire life inside this maze. You have never stepped outside.
That sounds exhausting, honestly.
It really does. But if you spent your whole life there, you and everyone else trapped in the maze with you, well, you would spend all your time arguing over who has the weirdest proportions.
Because that's all you know.
Exactly. You would develop entire sciences, complex economic theories, and sprawling philosophies based entirely on the reflections you see. But you would be missing the fundamental truth of your reality simply because you never realized that the mirrors themselves are curved.
You're just looking at the distortion.
Right. You cannot get an accurate picture of what is real by just looking harder at the reflection. You actually have to stop looking at the image and start examining the shape of the mirror.
Which is, an incredibly difficult thing to do when the mirror is literally the only tool you have ever used to see yourself.
Yeah, how do you even step back from that?
Well, you have to realize that the problem isn't that your eyesight is bad or that you aren't analyzing the reflection closely enough. The problem is the medium itself.
The mirror.
Yes. And until you realize the medium is flawed, every single conclusion you draw is going to be fundamentally compromised.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we are attempting to find the exit to the funhouse.
It's a big goal for today.
It is. We are exploring a fascinating analytical framework called systems archaeology. It argues that everything we think we know about reality, our news, our historical narratives, our cultural debates, it's all warped by invisible filters.
Highly warped.
And more importantly, it offers a radical method for scraping those filters away. We really want to change how you process information today. So okay, let's unpack this. The core problem we run into when trying to find objective truth is a basic human error. We treat outputs as baseline reality.
We do. I mean, we look at the world, we observe an output. Maybe it's a sudden shift in the stock market or a bizarre voting trend or even just a conflict in our workplace, and we accept that output as the raw data of reality.
So just take it at face value.
Exactly. We think, okay, this is what happened now. How do I interpret it? But this framework argues that those outputs are not raw data at all. They are already highly processed products of a filtered system.
So going back to the analogy, we are mistaking the reflection in the funhouse mirror for the actual object standing in front of it.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
And the framework introduces a very specific definition for the environment we are operating in. It calls it the zeitgeist.
The zeitgeist. Now, normally we use that word to mean like the general mood or the cultural vibe of an era.
Right, like the zeitgeist of the 1980s or whatever.
Yeah.
But in this context, the zeitgeist is defined as the prevailing interpretive baseline. It is the invisible architecture of assumptions that a society shares.
The invisible architecture. I like that.
And what's fascinating here is that this baseline is inherently systematically biased. If the baseline is biased, you absolutely cannot achieve accurate understanding by just refining the outputs within that system.
You have to shift your focus to the generative structure producing them. So let's get specific about how that bias actually functions. Because the concept outlines 3 specific embedded filters that shape our perception. It talks about language, identity, and social norms.
Those are the big 3.
And what really struck me is when these filters operate, it argues that they act on us before interpretation even begins. I mean, I need you to break that down because I think our default assumption is that we see an event clearly, and then our identity or our language tells us how to feel about it.
Yeah, that assumption is exactly what this framework is trying to dismantle. Let's look at language, for example. Language doesn't just describe reality. It actively categorizes it before your conscious brain can even get involved.
Wait, really? Before you're even conscious of it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about behavioral economics. If a financial portfolio drops by 10% and the market dashboard labels it a correction, your brain processes that data fundamentally differently than if the dashboard flashes red and calls it a crash.
Oh, wow. Yeah, crash sounds terrifying.
Exactly. The word crash triggers a precognitive physiological stress response. The filter of language has already narrowed your interpretive options to panic or defense before you've even looked at the underlying math.
That makes a lot of sense. The categorization happens instantly. So what about identity and social norms? How do they act pre-interpretation?
Well, take identity. If you identify strongly as an environmental activist and you see an image of a new factory being built, your visual cortex is quite literally primed to spot smokestacks and deforestation.
Because that's what matters to that identity.
Right. But if your identity is a corporate developer, you are visually primed to see infrastructure and job creation. You aren't seeing the exact same raw image and then disagreeing on its merit. Your identity filter is sorting the visual data before it reaches your conscious awareness.
That is wild to think about.
And then you have social norms, which dictate what we are even allowed to look at. In a corporate boardroom, social norms will completely filter out certain radical solutions.
They just aren't brought up.
Exactly. Those ideas aren't debated and rejected. The norm prevents them from even being perceived as options in the first place.
So these filters basically intercept the data before you even know you are analyzing it. They create what the text calls consistent distortions, meaning the mirror is curved the exact same way every single time you look into it.
And not just for you. For everyone in your social sphere, that is the true danger of the zeitgeist. These distortions appear completely normal because they are shared.
Right.
If everyone you know is wearing the exact same green-tinted glasses and you all look at the sky, you will all agree that the sky is neon green. Your shared distortion becomes your shared reality.
And anyone who suggests taking the glasses off sounds completely unhinged. So if shared delusions feel like reality, we obviously can't trust our own perceptions to fix the problem. We can't just try to be more objective within the funhouse. We need a method that bypasses human perception entirely, which is where the concept of systems archaeology comes in.
Systems archaeology is a brilliant term because it tells you exactly what the methodology requires. We aren't going to build a new grand unified theory. We are going to dig. The method is entirely structural and subtractive.
I want to highlight that word, subtractive.
Yeah.
Because normally when we want to understand something complex, our instinct is additive.
We always want more.
Yeah, we want more data. We read another book. We layer on a new sociological framework. We consult another expert. We think, if I just gather enough different perspectives and stack them on top of each other, eventually I'll build a staircase to the truth.
Which is frankly just adding more layers of dirt over the archaeology site.
Right.
If every perspective you add is just another output from a flawed, filtered system, you are only compounding the distortion. This approach completely reverses the typical direction of analysis. Instead of moving from theory to application, like taking a lens and applying it to the world systems, archaeology moves backward. It moves from the output back to the structure.
I think we need to upgrade our metaphor here. The funhouse mirror explains the problem, but it doesn't quite explain the solution. It feels a lot more like art restoration.
Oh, I like that.
Imagine you have a classic Renaissance painting, but it has been hanging in a smoky cathedral for 400 years. It is covered in layers of soot, grime, and cheap varnish applied by later, less talented artists.
That is a much better way to visualize the subtractive process.
Right, and if you want to see the original masterpiece, you don't shine a brighter, high-tech spotlight onto the dirty canvas. A brighter light just gives you a higher definition view of the grime.
Yeah, it doesn't help at all.
You have to use chemical solvents to carefully strip away the varnish. You have to subtract the centuries of accumulated distortion to reveal the original brushstrokes underneath.
That is exactly what systems archaeology demands we do with information. We trace surface expressions like a deeply held cultural belief or an economic trend back through the conditions that generated them. We excavate.
Okay, but let's talk about the actual chemicals in the solvent. How do we strip the varnish? The framework says we need to identify where identity, norms, or language are constraining our perception, and then we must suspend or bracket them.
Yes, bracketing.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because anyone familiar with philosophy might recognize the term bracketing from Edmund Husserl and phenomenology. But for those of us not reading 20th century German philosophy over breakfast, what does it practically mean to bracket your identity? We aren't denying they exist, right? We're just temporarily muting them so they don't influence our interpretation.
Yes, exactly. It is not a denial of their existence, and it's certainly not an attempt to become some magical, emotionless robot. Bracketing is the temporary, intentional removal of their influence on your interpretation.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
Think of it like a scientist isolating a variable in a laboratory experiment. The scientist knows that wind and friction exist in the real world, but to understand the pure mechanics of gravity, they have to temporarily pump all the air out of the chamber. You create a vacuum to observe the underlying mechanics.
So you're intentionally muting the volume on your own biases. You are saying, I recognize that my language wants to categorize this event as a tragedy. I recognize my political identity wants to blame someone for it, and I recognize my social norms demand I express outrage.
Right.
But I am going to place all three of these highly conditioned reactions in a mental bracket, set them on a shelf, and look solely at the structural mechanics of what just happened.
Yes. Because the ultimate aim here is not to replace one interpretation with another. We aren't trading a conservative lens for a liberal lens or a Western lens for an Eastern lens. The aim is to radically reduce our reliance on interpretation itself.
Wait, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Isn't finding consensus among diverse experts the absolute bedrock of the scientific method and journalistic integrity?
Right.
If I want to understand a geopolitical crisis, and I gather a military general, an economist, and a human rights lawyer, and they all look at the situation through their unique filters, shouldn't I be looking for where their interpretations overlap? Are we really throwing that out?
We aren't throwing out their expertise, no.
Yeah.
But we have to be incredibly careful about what consensus actually means in a filtered system. If you gather those three experts and they find common ground, you haven't necessarily found the objective truth.
What have I found then?
You might have just found the overlap in the funhouse mirrors. You found the spot where their individual biases happen to harmonize.
Oh, wow, that's a trap.
It is. Systems archaeology says, by all means, look at the system across all those different contexts, the military, the economic, the humanitarian. But don't look for the agreement or the overlap in their opinions. Look for the raw behavior of the system that stubbornly persists regardless of how they frame it.
Okay, so we are hunting for something specific.
Yeah.
If we strip away the filters, what's actually left in the dirt for us to find? The framework calls these persisting patterns invariants, things that do not vary.
Correct. Invariants are structural relationships that refuse to change, no matter what interpretive lens you try to force onto them.
I need a concrete example of this.
Right.
Walk me through a real-world case study. What does it actually look like to strip away the varnish and find an invariant?
Let's apply this to something incredibly common, yet completely distorted by interpretation. Let's talk about the concept of debt.
Okay, debt.
Let's say there is a massive debt crisis. How do our filters handle this? Well, a moral philosopher looks at debt and interprets it as a promise, right? A binding ethical contract between two humans.
Sure, a moral obligation.
Right. But a sociologist looks at debt and sees a power dynamic. They see a tool used by the wealthy to subjugate the working class.
Okay, very different view.
And then a banker looks at debt and sees leverage, a mathematical tool for accelerating growth.
So that's three entirely different interpretations, all driven by the identity and the specialized language of the observer.
Exactly. And if we try to find consensus among those three, we will just end up with a messy, compromised policy that satisfies literally no one. But if we practice systems archaeology, we bracket the moral outrage, we bracket the sociological power theories, and we bracket the banking jargon, we ask, what is the generative structure producing this thing called debt? What is the invariant?
Oh, what is it?
The invariant is simply the mathematical transfer of future resources to the present, governed by the mechanics of compound interest. That underlying structure, that specific relational pattern of time, resources, and compounding math remains completely identical, whether you are looking at a modern Wall Street hedge fund, a medieval farming village, or a Babylonian grain ledger. The math doesn't care if you call it a sin, a crime, or a smart investment. The structural mechanics are invariant.
That is fascinating. So the invariant is the pure architecture. It's the bare metal underneath the paint. And the framework gives a very specific and historically loaded name to this underlying structural consistency. It calls it the logos.
It does. And we need to be very precise here, because the word logos comes with thousands of years of philosophical and theological baggage.
Yeah, it sounds very mystical.
But the framework explicitly strips away the metaphysical connotations. It is not talking about a divine word or a spiritual force. In this model, the logos is purely structural. It simply refers to the consistency that remains when distortion is removed. It is the set of stable relationships that hold true across variation, totally independent of culturally reinforced interpretations.
So the logos is the actual shape of the object standing in front of the mirror. It's the original brushstrokes of the painting.
Yes. And once you find those invariants, the logos, you use them as your foundation. You rebuild your understanding of the world, not from inherited categories or social norms, but from these stable, persistent patterns.
Which brings us to what I think is the most radical paradigm-shifting claim of this entire framework. Because if we take this seriously, it demands a complete overhaul of how we approach learning and staying informed. I mean, we are constantly told that we live in the information age.
Right.
We are told to read more articles, consume more data, watch more documentaries, accumulate, accumulate, accumulate.
But if all that knowledge is just more interpretation, more filtered outputs, then accumulating it doesn't make you wiser. It just buries you deeper in the zeitgeist. It makes you an expert in the shape of the distortions.
Wow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the central, undeniable claim of this framework is that truth is not found through the accumulation of interpreted data. Truth is found through the elimination of distortion.
Truth is the elimination of distortion. That fundamentally changes the goal. It means the smartest person in the room isn't the one who has memorized the most opinions or read the most reports. The smartest person is the one who can identify the filters, bracket them, and isolate the structural mechanics that are actually driving the outcome.
Precisely. A system understood through its invariants provides a much more reliable, actionable foundation than one understood through its most popular interpretations.
So how do we actually do this? Because we promised at the start of this deep dive that we were exploring a tool you could actually use, not just a thought experiment to mull over in a coffee shop. How do you, the listener, practice systems archaeology tomorrow morning?
You start by changing your immediate reaction to new information. Whether you are analyzing a complex market report for work, reading a news article about a societal trend, or sitting in a tense strategy meeting, you are going to be handed outputs, and your default instinct will be to immediately apply your own interpretive filter. You will want to judge it, categorize it, or argue with it.
So the first step is to pause. Stop yourself from adding a new layer of varnish. And here is a highly specific, practical mental exercise you can use to start finding the logos. Next time you read a report or an article that you strongly agree or disagree with, try this. Mentally rewrite the core findings, but force yourself to strip out all the adjectives and narrative verbs.
That is a phenomenal exercise.
Yeah, strip out words like surprising, disappointing, aggressive, unprecedented, or reckless. Those words are the language filters telling you how to interpret the data. If you remove them, what is left? You're left with just the nouns, the numbers, and the raw actions. You are left with the behavior of the system.
And once you strip away the narrative, you can begin to ask the structural questions. What conditions made this outcome inevitable? What patterns here persist regardless of whether the author is happy or angry about them? It takes rigorous practice.
It sounds really hard.
It is exhausting at first to constantly catch your own brain trying to slip the filters back on, but once you start seeing the world in terms of underlying structures rather than surface interpretations, you literally cannot unsee it.
You become an archaeologist of truth. You start seeing the curved glass of the mirror everywhere, and you finally stop arguing about the reflections. But as we wrap up, this leaves me with one massive, lingering paradox. And this is what I want to leave you, the listener, to wrestle with today as you go about your life.
I love a good paradox.
The framework argues that we have to strip away the filters of identity, social norms, and especially the filter of language.
Because language is perhaps the most insidious distortion of all. It categorizes reality before we can even comprehend it.
Right. So let's assume you master this. You successfully practice systems archaeology, you dig through the zeitgeist, you bracket your social norms, you mute your identity, and you completely remove the distorting filter of words. You finally uncover the pure, underlying logos, the raw, invariant structure of reality.
The bare metal.
Exactly. But if that pure truth exists entirely outside of language, how do you even comprehend it in your own mind? And more importantly, is it even possible to share that pure truth with someone else without immediately having to put it right back through the funhouse mirror of words?
That is the ultimate trap of the human condition.
It really is. Something to think about the next time you try to explain reality to a friend or a colleague. Pay attention to the varnish you are applying to the canvas. Keep digging, keep questioning the shape of the mirror, and we will see you on the next deep dive.